When you know who you are and where you come from, the path ahead becomes clearer. As world cultures evolve in today's society, when we really find out more about them, we can bring their values afront. When the best bits of all races mix in this melting pot of today's society, we, as a species, can evolve. We all have our own different journeys and cultural connection stories. In my talk, I hope to share mine and how that has taught me the importance in cultural connection into our everyday lives. So before I get into my specific story, I want you to think back to roughly 5 to 10 years ago. When somebody asked you, where do you come from? What were they really asking? Was it the place you were born? Was it the place you grew up in? Was it the place that was associated with your gene pool or race? And most importantly, was this place where you had come from a place you called home? In my experience, the expected answer would always be congruent with the race or ethnicity. But I want to highlight that sometimes in the modern world where people have traveled all over, this is not necessarily the case. Some people have multiple cultural identities, or an identity that's not associated with their race or where they grew up in. Or they have an identity that you can't exactly pin on the world map or associate with the country. Especially as an international student, the hardest part initially was to connect with and uphold my Indian culture despite living abroad. Our culture is more than just where we come from. It's our upbringing. It's what drives our value systems, and more often than not, makes an essential part of who we are. So my story started the way most immigrant stories started, with facing unconscious bias and racial discrimination. It ended with me looking within myself and using that as a positive force, with the help of my family, to really discover why I do things the way I do and who I am as a person. So during most of my primary years, I had faced racism. I was told many things, but some of the things I was told was that my culture, something that was sacred and built up and passed down from generation to generation by my ancestors, was weird. That my hair was oily, or my food was smelly, or that our mythology was unrealistic, and that all Indians were put into this stereotype that was neither accurate nor depicted in a reliable way. Especially during this time, one person wouldn't hang out with me because they believed that I had my own race to hang out with. And I was at a young age at that time, so I couldn't fathom that this was racism. And it was so much easier to just go with it and just to accept it, rather than to fight back for what was right, which in this case was fighting for my culture. At this time, I was made to feel embarrassed and excluded, and this made me question everything from my language to my traditions in general. I'm not saying all this to make you feel the need to neglect your own language or culture or teachings. But no child should feel embarrassed of their background. This was at a time when people were learning how to read and write, yet at the same time, unfortunately, making such stereotypes as well. Like I said, I was at a young age, so I didn't understand that somebody else's interpretation of my cultural identity does not define my cultural identity. And I really want to highlight that, as one thing I've learned is that our identity is our own. To each is to their own. And it's an opportunity for you to grow yourself, and nobody can take that chance away from you. So it was because of hearing all this that the feelings of disconnect started to sink in. So I want to tell you about a time I went back to India roughly 5 years ago. As soon as I landed, I was flooded with such a familiar sensation. Despite living in Singapore my entire life, I felt drawn to every single person, place, and aspect of India. I could read the road signs that weren't in English, and I could understand every single joke, saying, or subtle communication. I had a mutual understanding with every other person. I felt like that because we knew that we had a culture and we shared a way of living and values that definitely went way deeper. When I was in India, I wasn't made to feel embarrassed or excluded, but I felt like I was at home because I was connected, grounded, involved, and comfortable. This made me realize that this was where my true core being had originated from. And this was when I decided to put everything behind me and really dive into my culture. So as soon as I got back to Singapore, I just did. I started learning my language, and I started learning about all the mythology that was once considered unrealistic. But learning stories like Guru Dakshina, the story of Sita and Parvati, or Shiva, I got to learn about the real lessons that you're just taught through all of these stories. And I think that they're really cool. And I know that I'm connected with my culture because when I say that my culture is the Indian culture, I say it loud and proud. Especially every single time I speak Hindi, I can't help but smile at myself because I would rewire my thought process to fit with the grammar and structure. And I didn't just play catch up in terms of the textbook things, like speaking or listening, but I got to learn the subtle communications that are just integrated into the language. I got to see that this was how we express our culture, and it was learning sayings like "Karam kar, phal ki chinta mat kar," that I really got to learn that some things, you can't just translate it without getting the meaning across. And this has led me to believe that our language is definitely part of our wider cultural identity. It's how we put our ideas across. And while it does define certain thought processes, especially how you put forward ideas and how you express what you're thinking, it's an acquired skill. You can learn a new language. So it's as fluid as we can make it, especially as there are things like connotations or things that are just unspoken communications that you get to learn about. So I want to highlight that while my experience did have some degree of damage, it's instilled a greater form of appreciation within me. All stories are different, and you don't have to disconnect with your culture to reconnect with it. In fact, you can take pride in your culture right here and right now, as it's a journey of self-discovery and something you can take in your own hands. However, personally, I may not have appreciated my culture as deeply if I hadn't gone through this journey of discovery, as I understand greater who I am as a person. I feel more connected with my roots, engaged with my family, and traditions. I now understand why I do things the way I do, and my thought process, my parents' thought processes, and how we can build on that. My quality of life is greater because now I understand who I am as a person. And I know that my roots became my branches, and my values blossomed. And now I understand who I am as a person in my everyday life. Our culture is more than just where we come from. It's our upbringing. It's what drives our value systems, and more often than not makes an essential part of who we are. We must forgive, but never forget. And we must not live in suffering or in the past, but learn from it to apply it to the future. Especially in the modern world where people are traveling all over and as the world's becoming more connected amid sociological and technological revolutions, now is the perfect opportunity for us to ask ourselves these big questions. Who are we as human beings? What are our values as a society? How does that translate into our everyday life? And most importantly, once we have these answers, we can fight injustice and racism and live in harmony. When we travel, we take with us our cultures. Cultures mix and cultures evolve, and so do we as human beings. When we can find out who we are and who we're not, we can build on that and evolve collectively. Thank you.